Today we'll answer questions people ask us about polling and the election.
What campaigns tell me about how they use polls.
And how cell phones have changed polling. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Gallup Editor-in-Chief.
I'm Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today.
And this is Election Matters. Well, Susan, we get lots of questions. You get them, I get them. They come into Gallup.com about polling. So today we're going to answer some of these questions. And the first one that you talked about was the extent to which presidential candidates and their campaigns not only poll themselves, but pay attention to polling. And the answer to that is they pay a lot of attention.
They pay a lot of attention when we do the USA Today Gallup poll. The campaigns of all sorts are very interested in finding out what we found. And if it's negative for their candidate, sometimes disputing aspects of the poll. They don't do that when it's good for their candidate for some reason.
That is strange.
I'll tell you the other thing that campaigns tell me, presidential campaigns, which is that they do a lot of polling, but they do no national polling. I don't think any presidential campaign has done national polling for several cycles because they're focused on the Electoral College, and so they are doing battleground states.
Let's come back to that in a second, but you know, George W. Bush used to publicly say when he was president, along with Vice President Cheney, that he did not pay attention to the polls. Remember that? In his speeches, he said it a lot. And yet you know, and I know, that Karl Rove, for example, who was working in the White House, was obsessive about polls, right? He polled, he studied polls. So even if the president himself is, quote, not paying attention to polls, right, the staffs are clearly paying lots of attention.
Well, you know, in that administration, I think Vice President Cheney took some delight in doing things that were unpopular, as though that was a sign of bravery and some spine. I think President George W. Bush spent a little more time and paid a little more attention to polls than he indicated. But he's not the only one. Presidents of both parties try to downplay how much they pay attention to polls.
And yet I think research shows, going back to even Roosevelt, they pay attention to polls. Most of them pay a lot of attention to polls. You raised an interesting question, our second question, and that is we do a lot of national polling, but you said the campaigns themselves focus on the states, and we all know in the Electoral College system, it's the states that matter. So a lot of people ask us why we pay attention to the national poll. And there's some answers to that.
Well, I'll say one reason that USA Today wants to do national polling is because we're USA Today. We're not battleground states USA. We want to pay attention to the mood across the country, attitudes across the country, even in states that are safely Democratic or safely Republican.
And also keep in mind that almost always, 2000 being one of the rare exceptions, the national popular vote mirrors what happens in the Electoral College. So it's more efficient. That's one argument I give. I mean, it might be nice if we could poll every single night or every week in all 50 states and put it together, but that's very costly and very expensive. So by just polling nationally and then tracking nationally, the ups and downs we find are pretty reflective, we think, of what's going on, particularly in the key battleground states. So it's a good shorthand way to understand what's happening in the election.
And it's a way to respect the opinions of all Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that absolutely as well, because sometimes we're asking more than just who you're going to vote for, and it's good to know how all Americans are reacting to the issues of the day. What should we be paying attention to? If you had to choose three key poll indicators for our vast audience watching Election Matters right now, what would we say they should pay attention to?
Well, let me mention one, and then maybe you can tell us another. I think you pay attention to the trend. You know, the absolute number can be high or low and hard to judge, but when you see whether support for President Obama among women is going up or down, that tells you meaningfully, I think, what's happening with the electorate. What would be a second thing that you look for?
Well, in this election this year, I would pay attention to job approval. It's a great measure. It's a simple measure, but it reflects a lot of different things, and we have a incumbent who's attempting to get reelected. So I think in a year like this, if you had to choose only one measure, out of any measure we can choose to kind of understand what's going on in America, particularly relating to politics, I would say presidential job approval.
And of course, direction of the country, satisfaction with the direction of the country. I think another really important measure to look at, not just for the presidential race, for members of Congress, for incumbents up and down the ballot.
Absolutely, and that correlates with economic confidence, which is another key measure, satisfaction and economic confidence. And finally, we're going to be tracking the ballot. By that I mean who you're going to vote for, you know, Obama or the Republican candidate. And of course we want to pay attention to that because that kind of summarizes what's going on. But I think this year that's going to be pretty highly correlated with presidential job approval. Finally, cell phones. I can't tell you how many times people ask me that. Well, don't you know that my son and daughter don't have landlines? They only have cell phones, and therefore you're not representing them. Well, I say thanks for sharing, but we're kind of aware that that trend's going on. Since 2008 at Gallup, we have been including cell phones, and we've been increasing regularly the percent of our interviews that are actually done with people with cell phones. So we are representing that segment in our polling.
And you know, that's something that when people are looking to judge polls, whether they're legitimate polls, whether they should pay attention to them, I think looking at whether they poll by cell phones and whether they have real people doing the interviews rather than these robocalls are things to look at when you're trying to assess the quality of a poll.
That's right. Robo-polling cannot call cell phones. So if you're going to use robo-polling, you have to supplement with other ways of trying to represent that segment, and that does get very, very complex. One final point, people nowadays are looking at Twitter and Facebook, social media, you know, and saying, well, we can actually, because we have millions and over time, billions of these tweets to look at, we can kind of get a feel for public opinion by analyzing those. And that's something we're looking into here at Gallup. You know, we're actually looking at it because we don't want to turn away any kind of assessment of public opinion, but it's not random. So it's the jury's still out about how much that can tell us.
Well, I'd say that would work for me and my kids, but for my 90-year-old mother in Wichita, Kansas, you are not going to capture her public opinion on Twitter.
Yeah, and even people who, like you and I, have phones, smartphones and all that, we don't tweet a lot necessarily, so it isn't representative. But, again, if we can prove over time that the sentiment reflected in tweets correlates with some outcome, hey, we'll look at it.
That'll be fun to see.
Yeah. That's it. Questions that people ask. You talk, I talk, we make speeches. A lot of questions people ask about polling, so we're happy to be able to answer them. I'm Frank Newport, Gallup Editor-in-Chief.
I'm Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today.
And this is Election Matters.